I'm Andy Geeter, Vice President of Enrollment Management at Andrew College. Well, thank you for joining me for part 2 of our financial aid session. This is really the meat of the session where we talk about the FAFSA. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can get started. Okay, this part 2 is the basics of the FAFSA. Now, what does the FAFSA do? The FAFSA provides a student with a number called the EFC, the Expected Family Contribution. And I'll define that here in just a moment. But that number is used by the federal government to determine the student's eligibility for a Pell Grant. Now, what a college does is we use that number to determine eligibility for institutional assistance. And that'll tell us what a student's financial need is. And again, I'll define that here in just a moment. First term, the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid. Keep in mind the word there is free. Okay, it does not cost you anything to file the FAFSA. Number of years ago, there was an organization that would file your FAFSA for $79.95. But again, it's free. If you use a tax preparer to do it, which you can, then of course it would be a fee from that tax preparer. But the form itself is free to complete. As I mentioned, you get the expected family contribution is the number you receive back from the FAFSA. And what that is the amount of money the federal government says you can afford to help send your student to college. Colleges love acronyms, by the way. The next one is COA, or the cost of attendance. Now, there are two types of cost of attendance. There's the total cost of attendance. Now, that includes room, board, tuition, an estimate for books, fees, and living expenses. Typically, this amount is going to be more than just the cost of room, board, and tuition. When you're looking at just the costs of room, board, and tuition, you're looking at the direct costs. Room, board, tuition, and mandatory fees only. Now, Andrew College has no mandatory fees, so that would not be you would not need to consider that. Just room, board, and tuition would be the direct cost of attendance. Now, what a college does is take that cost of attendance, and then we subtract out that expected family contribution. And what's left over is a student's financial need. Now, the EFC will not change no matter what school it is. The cost of attendance will change depending upon the college. So therefore, your financial need may change depending on the colleges that you're applying to. Now, what a college does is we then try to create a financial aid package that comes as close as we can to meeting that financial need. Now, financial aid package may be any one of or all 4 of the categories we talked about in part 1: grants, scholarships, loans, and work study. Now, keep in mind with loans are a family decision. We make them available to students and families. However, if a student decides not to take a loan, that's fine. That's up to y'all. But know that that is not replaced by grant money. So a student's balance will rise. Now, before you file the FAFSA, if you've not done it yet, now some of you may have done this already. Some of you may be juniors that will need to do it next year. Before filing the FAFSA, the student and a parent will need to obtain an FSA ID. If you're an independent student, meet one of those independent categories, which typically are 24 or above, orphan or ward of the court, homeless or at risk of being homeless, have a child for whom you supply at least 50% of the support, or active duty military, or married. Those things make you an independent student. Typically, unless you meet one of those categories, then you're considered to be a dependent student, which means both your income information and your parents' income information will be listed on the FAFSA, which is why both the parent and the student will need to obtain an FSA ID. The FSA ID is used to help you electronically sign the FAFSA. Now, can you fill out the FAFSA without doing an FSA ID? Yes, you can. However, what will happen is you will get a signature page back. You will sign the FAFSA. You will mail it in. it will delay the process by up to 6 weeks if you do not do the FSA ID. Okay. In order to get the FSA ID, you will need to have your Social Security number available and a distinct email address. What I mean there is both the student and parent need to have different email addresses. What you do is studentaid.gov, you'll see the FSA ID create. You will go to creating the FSA ID, create an account. Okay. And it will be for either students or parents, depending upon the correct one that you're doing. Okay. Normally it takes about 10 to 15 minutes to fill out the FSA ID. It does take 1 to 3 days for the federal government to process it. So what that means is you may be able to go ahead and start on your FAFSA at that point after completing the FSA ID. However, you probably shouldn't submit it or would not be able to submit it until after that 3-day period and you receive notification that indeed your FSA ID has been accepted and verified. The reason being that it does compare you against various databases, Social Security numbers, things like that, to make sure you are who you say you are. And once you have that, that means you can typically log in to the FAFSA with either your FSA ID or that distinct email address, as long as you have your password. Now, the FAFSA, you'll see here, studentaid.gov, complete the FAFSA form. If you're starting here, you just click right there, or if you're returning, you click right there. Now, they changed this a couple of years ago to where now either the student or the parent can start the FAFSA. So either one of y'all can start the process. However, please make sure if one of you is starting the process, you create what's called a save key. A save key is a 4 to 6 digit number that allows access to the parent if the student created it, or the student if the parent created it. And that way, both sets of information can be included in the FAFSA. Okay, the FAFSA for this year, which is for the upcoming school year 2022-2023, is open. It's based upon your families and yours, if you work then, 2020 tax return. Now, this was the one that was filed by April 15th, 2021, not the one that was just filed, 2021, based upon your 2020 tax return. It's what's known as prior. Used to be you couldn't file the FAFSA until after January the 1st because you need to have your taxes done for that year. This changed under the Obama administration, so now it's prior. So the 2020 tax return that was filed by April 15th, 2021 is what you'll be using. Okay. You also need information about any savings accounts and investments that you have. Remember, the FAFSA is an income-driven instrument. It does not take debt into account. A little bit information about savings accounts. One of the things, and this usually doesn't make a huge difference with people, but sometimes it makes a little bit of a difference. Normally, if I have money in my checking and savings account, the day I have the lowest amount of money is right before payday. So if you can, do the FAFSA right before payday when those amounts are at the lowest. Now, as I mentioned earlier, financial aid packaging, financial aid office make the total cost of attendance, subtract out the expected family contribution to get your financial need. And then we try to put together a package that meets or comes as close as we can to offsetting your student's financial need. We're not able to guarantee to meet 100% of need. Most colleges cannot do that. There are a few Ivy League colleges that can do it, and that's pretty much it. We can very often through a Parent Plus loan, and I'll talk about that in a little while, but again, we can't guarantee to meet 100% need. We do as well as we can for all of our students. Now, before I get to part 3, let me go back and mention, because I talked about the plus loan for a second, and this will come up later. The plus loan, parent loan to undergraduate students, is available for parents to borrow additional loan money above what the student is borrowing. This can be taken out for any amount up to the total cost of attendance minus other aid the student is receiving. In addition to the plus loan, if you'd rather go through instead, if it's a better thing to work through your bank, that is fine. We also work with Sallie Mae as well as a private alternative lender. Now, I'm going to close part 2 of this, and in part 3, we're going to take a look at federal, state, and institutional aid programs.